Hello and welcome to Woodworking Fever More. On today's project we're actually building a floating shelf with the hidden compartment. Check it out. It uses an RFID to open it, and I made one inside your basically a bracelet, and then you also have one in the card. So once I got ready to figure out what I'm building, I started to glue up some stock. They were just regular pallet wood that I found that I just took apart. They were about 3.5 inches by 3/4. So I planed them down to where you get the edges pretty straight and just ended up gluing them. Some of the edges had a little bit of a run over where the bark was. I did glue up a little bit bigger piece, and then I would make a little bit smaller pieces what I need. Here I didn't have the proper clamps that I needed, so I ended up just following Izzy Swan on YouTube and used his method of just screwing it down to my bench and just running some wedges into the edge and just clamping it together. After planing it down, which was a long time, I ended up cutting it down to a really rough edge where I needed it, and then I started putting some pocket holes so then I can just dry fit this entire project before I start putting any glue in. That's why you see me just putting screws in all the where I put the pocket holes. Now later I'll take it apart and I'll glue it up once I mocked everything up. It took me a while to figure out. I actually screwed up a little bit. The stock was 3/4 inch, but by the time I planed everything down it was a little bit less, so it took me a while off camera to kind of align everything. But once I had that, I went ahead and started doing the end pieces. Those are actually going to help basically support the 45-degree angles, because wood tends to bow and not be straight. So I ended up putting in the top piece outside edges, and that's why I didn't glue them, because I knew I had to later on play around and figure out how to set it, because I've built one or two before as a prototype just to check, and now I'm actually building it final. So the top piece that I'm building right now, I actually I used a scrap piece to actually mark out the edge from the outside, basically offset it. And what I didn't realize is that I didn't really use a proper, first of all, I didn't proper piece, and second, I should have gave it at least a 1/8 gap. You see me putting that piece right there. I should have left a little bit more gap, so that way I have a little bit of more playroom. But I ended up basically just butting everything up and just trying to get everything as almost perfect as possible. And here you can see me putting it together. I had to actually kind of force it together. That's when I took it apart off camera and I had to kind of move it over a little bit. And this shot here, I started to do the trim work, the top and the bottom. So I basically mocked it all up by using masking tape just to see if I have enough material, enough stock, and cutting the edges. I decided later to paint this project, so I shouldn't have used pocket hole screws, but I kind of figure something else out whenever it comes to painting, that the wood grain comes through. So you'll see this in a little bit ahead. But here I started mocking up the trim on top, and then I ended up cutting the same amount on the bottom, but I ended up doing that a little bit later because I wasn't really sure how the pieces are going to come together. All the videos that I've seen of people making them, they've always done the bottom portion smaller than the top portion, and I could never figure out why. I kind of wanted a square one, so I ended up making a square one, and then I realized later on why people actually make the bottom portion that opens up smaller. That's because whenever it shuts, it actually has a different swing, and you have to make sure you don't see the gaps. So that's why I ran into a little bit of problems. I'll explain a little bit later. But here I basically decided I like what I seen. I like how the shape it was, so I started to glue everything up. I ran the screws out back again, and then I start gluing everything up. and well, I ended up using the wrong screws, and I stripped some of the pocket holes, basically where the pocket hole was. I ended up stripping it, so I ended up kind of flipping it a little bit and putting in a little bit bigger screws, trying to put this whole thing together nice, nicer. I ended up using wood fillers later and painting it. So this is where I ran into the problem right here. Once I had everything glued and basically finished, that's when I started dry fitting it, and I realized, man, I needed to put some force into taking it apart. So that's when I ended up shaving the sides a little bit and ended up modifying a little bit more. So now I'm building putting on the bottom trim. Now that bottom piece is not going to be moving, meaning that the other piece is not going to close up into it. So I attached it right away. The top piece where the bottom piece is going to go into it. I hope this makes sense. I ended up attaching it a little bit later. Once I knew what the swing was, once I had all the hinges in, that's when I attached the other trim, the top part, because I wasn't really sure how the gaps are going to work, how is it going to be. So these hinges were a little bit difficult to put on because as you can see, I have kind of gaps in there, so I had to adjust them. I had to move them up and down and just play with them off camera for quite a while. I don't really like those hinges. I wish I used some piano hinges, but I ended up figuring it out a little bit. So here's where I ended up attaching the trim to the bottom portion of the lid that basically folds down. As you can see, the top comes up, the bottom portion is that's the piece that gets the trim. So the problem I ended up later changing, the problem I ran into this is because the bottom portion, when it came up, it didn't sit on the lock that I use. It didn't lock perfectly. So when it came up, one of the sides, the left side or the right side, was ended up being a little bit higher than so the right side ended up being higher than the left side, and the lock didn't lock it perfectly. So later on, I'll show you. I ended up redoing the trim. I'll show you where and how I did it. But in this shot here, I'm basically testing out the hinges and seeing how everything's going to open. And you can see where it kind of doesn't open fully. That arrow where I'm pointing, I ended up making that piece smaller and kind of moving it in a little bit, so that way the bottom portion can come up and actually have a little bit more open space, meaning that it can open and close freely. So I sand everything down after I put some wood filler, and then ended up just using a regular Montana Gold spray paint. And I didn't actually anticipate of seeing the grain here when I painted it, because I've never really painted pine before. I usually stain it or not. So when I did this and I seen that the grain came through, I was actually kind of shocked. I actually liked it too. So that's me pointing out where you can see the grain. So then I played around with sanding it a little bit, and then I put in some I'll put it on the camera what I put up. I don't remember. It was a few months ago since I built this from me editing. Right here, there you see Minwax. So after I painted it, I put some Minwax on there, and then I basically just used a regular cloth and ended up just buffing it out, and it actually looked really amazing. I actually was pretty shocked how it turned out. It had that really solid finish on it. So the inside is basically a foam piece where you can put in anything you want, and this actually is for my brother, so he wanted to display his weapons. All the weapons you see on camera here are all legally bought and licensed. So my brother was actually standing off camera. You probably kind of see him a little bit there. He's actually kind of surprising. None of these weapons are loaded. So at first I did that white foam on the right that you see. I didn't really like it because I didn't have a full piece. I had to kind of like glue them together. It didn't work out really good, so I ended up just buying some Kaizen foam off of Amazon, and I went in, and since they're layered, you can as long as you control your depth, you can actually take off certain layers off. You can kind of see it here. So what I ended up doing is I ended up cutting all the way through and then gluing another piece underneath, and I went through all the weapons that he wanted to put in there, and the layout that he wanted. And took a little while, but I figured it out. It was a lot of fun. So once I had all that installed, I basically put everything in, and then I adjusted the hinges adjusted the hinges with a little hex screw over there, where you can actually adjust the opening, how fast it opens. Once all the weight was inside, you can adjust it whichever you want it. Here I'm basically explaining it. I'm gonna overlayer myself talking. What ended up happening is whenever the bottom portion closes, the trim didn't really work on top, like I said before. So what I ended up doing is I ended up taking the trim off, and then I had to paint everything and put all the finish on, and I ended up attaching that trim to the top portion, so that way the bottom, when it comes in, it hides underneath the trim. But then I ran into a problem where the bottom portion basically was a little thicker, meaning that the way it came up into the trim, it was too much. So I ended up cutting a bevel on the bottom portion, and when it comes up under the trim, you can't see the bevel. You can't see where I cut. So once I figured that out, I basically didn't want to show you on camera that I'm actually, redoing all this. Just letting you basically simply see what my mistakes were. And then once I had everything adjusted, I didn't really show on this camera here, but I'll put a link down below what I'm using. It's basically an RFID secret cabinet opener. I ended up installing that on here, and it works really, really good. The only problem I have with it is that whenever you put a lot of weight on it, it doesn't open really good, so you have to kind of push it up a little bit in order to release the pressure. Then you can scan it, and then it will open up. The cup you can keep next to your shelf or on your shelf, and then as long as you slide it into the position that you set it to, set your locker to, you can unlock it. So the cabinet lock has a little tiny chip like this, and the nice thing about this, it's so tiny you can actually put it inside a bracelet, and you can use that to unlock your cabinet. In the description down below, I'm going to have all the hardware that I use for this floating shelf. If you have any questions, please leave them down below. And thank you for joining me.